Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Skull and Hat's Tales. I'm always curious to know where the people who watch this channel are from. So before you relax, consider leaving a comment. Now, let's get started. The wilderness always felt like home. I thrived on the solitude of remote trails, the crisp air that carried no hint of civilization, and the thrill of discovering untouched corners of the world. This area was one I had read about in old hiking forums, a place so isolated that even seasoned explorers rarely ventured there. It was said to be pristine, almost sacred in its wildness, but with a hint of mystery that no one seemed eager to explain. The trailhead was overgrown, barely distinguishable from the surrounding forest. My pack was heavy, but the anticipation of the unknown spurred me forward. As the morning sun filtered through the dense canopy, I felt a familiar calm wash over me. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the leaf-strewn ground and the occasional trill of a bird. The deeper I went, the more the landscape changed. The forest grew denser, the trees standing impossibly close together, their branches intertwining overhead like a woven cathedral. It was beautiful, yet there was an odd energy to the place, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. About 2 hours in, I noticed something strange. A neat pile of stones stacked unnaturally by the base of a tree. It could have been made by another hiker, but there were no signs of recent activity. No footprints, no litter, nothing to suggest anyone had passed through here in years. I paused, taking a closer look. The stones were smooth, their edges weathered, and they were arranged with an unsettling precision. I shook it off and moved on, but a whisper of unease lingered in the back of my mind. As I ventured further, the oddities became harder to ignore. The first trap was subtle, just a simple snare made of thin wire strung low between two trees. I only noticed it because the sunlight caught the faint glint of the wire. At first, I thought it might have been set by a hunter, but there were no signs of hunting activity. No tracks, no signs of animals being caught. I pressed on, and within an hour I found another trap, this one far more elaborate. It was a pit concealed by a layer of branches and leaves, its edges lined with sharpened stakes. My stomach tightened as I stared at it. This wasn't the work of someone casually hunting game. It felt deliberate, as though it were meant to hurt or capture something specific. By mid-afternoon, I had counted 6 traps, each more intricate than the last. They were scattered haphazardly, with no clear pattern or logic, as though they were meant to cover as much ground as possible. My curiosity deepened, but so did my unease. Who had built these, and why? I told myself it was just the work of a survivalist or an eccentric recluse, but the growing number of traps made me question that comforting assumption. Someone had put a lot of thought into these, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not long after discovering the traps, I stumbled upon the first structure. It was a crude shelter, barely more than a pile of sticks leaned together like a teepee. At first glance, it seemed abandoned. There were no signs of recent use, no footprints, no fire pit. But as I moved closer, I noticed the markings. Carved into the wood were symbols, spirals, jagged lines, and shapes that didn't resemble any language I knew. They were deep, purposeful, and unsettling. The shelter felt less like a place someone had lived, and more like a monument to something I couldn't understand. Further exploration revealed more structures. Some were larger, with stone foundations and intricate weaving of branches. Others were smaller but no less bizarre, their designs almost ritualistic. One had what looked like animal bones scattered in a circle around it. The air felt heavier here, the silence oppressive. I spent the rest of the day examining the structures, cataloging them in my mind. They seemed too deliberate to be random, too scattered to belong to a single camp, and yet I couldn't find any sign of the person or people who had built them. By the time I realized the sun was dipping low on the horizon, I felt an uneasy pull to leave. As the light faded, the wilderness seemed to change. The air grew colder, and the once tranquil sounds of birds and rustling leaves faded into an eerie stillness. The structures I had been so fascinated by now felt like silent sentinels watching me with unseen eyes. The first noise came as I packed my gear. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of my own movements, a soft rustling like leaves shifting underfoot. I froze, listening intently, but the sound stopped. The forest was quiet again, but not in the way it had been earlier. This silence was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. As I began making my way back toward the trailhead, the noises returned. This time, they were louder. Branches snapping, a distinct crunch of footsteps. I stopped, scanning the shadows around me, but there was nothing there, or at least nothing I could see. My pulse quickened as I resumed walking, my pace slightly faster now. The sounds seemed to follow me, growing louder with each step. Every now and then, I caught glimpses of movement at the edges of my vision, a dark shape slipping between the trees, too fast and too fleeting to make out. By the time I realized I wasn't alone, it was too late to turn back. The path ahead seemed endless, the forest around me alive with the unsettling presence of whoever or whatever was out there. Night fell quickly in the forest, the last rays of light slipping away behind the dense canopy. My flashlight cut through the darkness in a narrow beam, illuminating only what lay directly ahead. But the real danger wasn't in front of me, it was behind. The soft rustle of leaves, the crack of twigs, and the unmistakable sound of footfalls confirmed it. I was being followed. I stopped, whipping my flashlight around, the beam dancing across the trees. The forest appeared empty, but the sounds didn't stop. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't hiding anymore. They wanted me to know they were there. My breathing quickened as I picked up the pace, my boots crunching against the forest floor. The path I had taken earlier seemed different now, unfamiliar, as though the forest itself had shifted to trap me. Every time I thought I recognized a landmark, a tree, a rock, a bend in the trail, it would disappear into the shadows, leaving me disoriented. Then I heard it, a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl but distinctly human. My blood turned cold. I turned sharply, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and for the first time, I caught a glimpse of my pursuer. A figure darted between the trees, too fast for me to make out details. But it was enough to know this wasn't an animal. This was a person, or something that used to be one. Panic surged as I broke into a run, my flashlight bouncing wildly, casting eerie shadows that seemed to lunge at me from the darkness. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, more deliberate. Whoever was following me wasn't bothering to hide anymore. The footfalls were heavy and deliberate, the sound of branches snapping underfoot echoing through the night. I ran blindly, my only focus on putting distance between myself and the thing behind me. My lungs burned and my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't dare slow down. The traps I had seen earlier flashed through my mind, their intricate designs meant to catch and harm. What if they weren't meant for animals? What if they were meant for me? Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted. My foot caught on something, a root, a rock, I wasn't sure, and I went sprawling forward, my flashlight skittering out of my hand. Pain shot through my palms as they scraped against the rough ground. I scrambled to grab the flashlight, my hands fumbling in the dirt, as the sounds of pursuit closed in. When I finally found the flashlight and turned it back on, I saw them. Just at the edge of the beam stood a figure, partially obscured by the shadows. Their posture was wrong, hunched, predatory, and their face was hidden behind something, a mask or cloth that added to their unnatural appearance. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, they took a step forward. Adrenaline took over, and I bolted. My mind screamed at me to think, to plan, but survival instincts drowned out everything else. The path ahead was barely visible, the flashlight's beam jerking with each frantic step. My only focus was to keep moving, to put as much distance between myself and the figure as possible. The noises behind me grew more erratic. Branches snapping, heavy breaths, the occasional guttural sound. It wasn't just one person. There were more, their presence confirmed by the cacophony of sounds echoing through the forest. They were trying to herd me, pushing me deeper into the wilderness. My heart sank as the path narrowed, the dense forest forcing me into a tight corridor of trees. I had to think fast. If I kept running blindly, I would either hit a dead end or run straight into one of their traps. Desperately, I veered off the path, crashing through the underbrush, hoping the thick vegetation would slow them down. The forest seemed endless, each step feeling heavier, the shadows pressing closer. Then, through the trees, I saw it, a faint light, a clearing. My breath hitched as I pushed forward, my legs burning with effort. The clearing grew brighter, and the noises behind me began to fade. as though the pursuers were reluctant to leave the cover of the forest. I burst into the clearing, collapsing onto the soft grass. The factory had always been there, looming on the edge of town like a shadow that never fully faded. Its rusted walls and shattered windows whispered of a past long forgotten, and its chain-link fence, bent and broken in places, offered little deterrence to those curious enough to step inside. For years I had driven by it, wondering what secrets it held. Tonight was the night. Armed with flashlights, my friends and I decided to explore the factory under the cover of darkness. It wasn't the most logical idea, probably not the safest either, but the thrill of doing something forbidden was too enticing to resist. We told ourselves it would be an adventure, a story to tell later. After all, it was just an old building, right? As we approached, the silence of the night was replaced by the soft crunch of gravel underfoot and the faint creak of the factory's aging structure. The air smelled of damp metal and decay, and the breeze carried a faint chill that raised the hairs on my arms. The entrance was easy to find, a large, jagged gap in the metal siding that yawned wide enough for us to step through. "Here we go," I muttered, ducking inside. My friends followed, their footsteps echoing faintly in the vast, empty space. Inside, the darkness felt thicker, heavier, as though the factory itself was reluctant to let us see its secrets. The factory's interior was a labyrinth of rusting machinery, crumbling walls, and forgotten debris. Our flashlights cut through the shadows, illuminating remnants of its former life. A conveyor belt frozen in time, stacks of broken crates, and faded posters curling on the walls. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped steadily, the sound amplified by the cavernous space. "Creepy," one of my friends murmured, their voice breaking the uneasy silence. It was creepy, but it was also fascinating. The place had a strange beauty, its decay telling a story we could only guess at. We wandered through the corridors, stepping over fallen beams and broken glass, our excitement mingling with a growing sense of unease. Then we heard it, a faint clang, like metal striking metal. We froze, flashlights darting toward the sound, but there was nothing there. "Probably just the wind," another friend said, laughing nervously. I nodded, though my heart had started to race. It was an old building, after all. Noises like that were normal, weren't they? We moved on, brushing off the sound as a trick of the environment. But as we ventured deeper into the factory, the atmosphere grew heavier, as though the building itself was watching us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't entirely alone. The deeper we explored, the stranger the factory seemed. My flashlight beam caught glimpses of odd markings on the walls, scratches that didn't look like they had been made by machinery. At first I thought they were graffiti, but they were too chaotic, too deliberate in their randomness. The noises started again, faint shuffles, distant thuds, the occasional clang of metal. They seemed to echo from every direction, making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. My friends joked nervously, their laughter too loud, too forced. I could tell they felt it too, that creeping sense of unease. As we entered a large chamber filled with towering machines, my friends began to lose their enthusiasm. "Let's head back," someone suggested, their voice tight. One by one, they began retreating toward the exit, but I lingered. Something about the place fascinated me, drew me in despite the fear prickling at the edges of my mind. "Just a few more minutes," I called after them. They hesitated, but ultimately left, their footsteps fading into the distance. I was alone now, the factory's silence pressing in around me like a physical weight. As I wandered through the empty corridors, my flashlight illuminated the intricate details of the machinery. Rust coated every surface, and vines had crept through the cracks, claiming the factory as part of the natural world. I felt a strange mix of awe and unease, as though I were trespassing in a place that didn't want me there. Then I heard it again, footsteps. This time they were deliberate, slow, and unmistakably close. My breath caught in my throat as I swung the flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness. The corridor behind me was empty, but the sound of the footsteps didn't stop. They were coming closer. Panic set in, and I moved quickly, ducking into a side room filled with towering machines. I pressed myself against the cold metal, listening intently. The footsteps were louder now, echoing through the factory with a steady, unnerving rhythm. Whoever it was, they were looking for me. Desperation took over as I spotted an old machine with enough space for me to squeeze inside. I climbed in, crouching low and clutching the flashlight to my chest. The rusty edges scraped against my skin, but I ignored the pain, focusing instead on the sound of the footsteps, now just outside the room. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. The footsteps paused, and the room fell silent. Then, I heard it. The faint creak of the machine's metal as something brushed against it. Whoever was out there knew I was close. The faint creak of the machine sent a jolt of panic through me. I shrank further into the cramped space, clutching the flashlight tightly to my chest, as though its faint glow could protect me. The footsteps resumed, deliberate and slow, circling the room like a predator stalking its prey. Each step reverberated in the hollow chamber, amplifying my terror. Then, the worst happened. As I shifted to get a better view through the gaps in the machine, a rusty panel groaned under my weight and snapped into place, trapping my leg. The pain was sharp and immediate, but it was the sound, metal screeching against metal, that made my heart race. It echoed loudly, far louder than I had intended to move. The footsteps stopped. My pursuer had heard. I froze, my breathing shallow, fighting the urge to cry out as I tried to pull my leg free. The machine's jagged edges dug into my skin, and every attempt to shift made the contraption creak ominously. Outside, the footsteps started again, slower this time, drawing closer. I could hear their breathing now, deep, uneven, as though they were savoring the hunt. They stopped directly in front of the machine. I held my breath, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. The space around me seemed to shrink as I waited, heart pounding, for whatever was coming next. Summoning every ounce of resolve, I began to work frantically to free myself. I gritted my teeth as I pushed and pulled against the machine's rusty mechanisms, each movement sending a jarring pain through my leg. The metal scraped loudly, each sound feeling like a flare signaling my location. The figure outside the machine didn't move, but I could feel their presence, an oppressive weight pressing down on me. Then, as if testing me, they began tapping lightly on the metal casing. The sound was methodical, deliberate, and terrifyingly close. I could imagine their hand gliding along the surface, waiting for a response. Panic clawed at my chest, but I forced myself to stay quiet. With a final, desperate effort, I pressed against the rusted panel, ignoring the sharp sting of metal cutting into my palms. The mechanism groaned loudly, and then mercifully it gave way. My leg was free. I didn't wait. Ignoring the pain, I slipped out of the machine and bolted toward the nearest door. The figure let out a guttural sound, a mix of frustration and rage, and the footsteps started again, faster this time, their rhythm frantic and unrelenting. The factory became a labyrinth as I ran, the corridors twisting and turning in ways I hadn't noticed before. My flashlight flickered, its weak beam casting frantic shadows that seemed to move on their own. Every corner I turned felt like a dead end, every doorway a potential trap. Behind me, the figure's pursuit was relentless. Their footsteps were erratic now, sometimes fading only to reappear closer, as though they knew the factory better than I ever could. I couldn't bring myself to look back, but I could hear them, panting breaths, the scrape of boots against the floor, and occasionally a low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. I stumbled into a large chamber filled with rusted catwalks and machinery towering into the darkness above. My flashlight illuminated a staircase leading to a door at the far end of the room. It had to be an exit. Summoning the last reserves of my strength, I sprinted toward it, the sound of my pursuer closing in behind me. As I reached the stairs, I felt something graze my shoulder, a hand, rough and cold, just missing its grip. The sensation sent a surge of adrenaline through me, and I pushed myself harder, practically throwing myself up the steps. The door loomed ahead, its chipped paint a beacon of hope. The door burst open with a loud crack, and I stumbled out into the night. The cool air hit me like a wave, sharp and biting against my sweat-soaked skin. I didn't stop running until I was well clear of the factory, my breaths coming in ragged gasps as I finally dared to look back. The factory stood in the distance, its jagged silhouette blending into the night. There was no sign of the figure, no sound of pursuit, but the memory of their presence lingered like a shadow. My heart thundered in my chest as I turned away, forcing my legs to carry me further. By the time I reached the safety of my car, the adrenaline was beginning to wear off, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. It started with little things, odd comments, unusual glances, and the occasional outburst that made everyone in the office fall silent. Marcus, the coworker who had always been a bit distant, was acting more erratic than usual. He muttered to himself as he walked the hallways, often staring out the window for long stretches, and sometimes snapping at colleagues over trivial matters. At first, I dismissed it. Everyone has bad days, and Marcus was known for being reclusive. But the tension in the office was undeniable. During meetings, his responses were curt and tinged with an underlying hostility that made people avoid direct confrontation. Once, I saw him storm out of the break room, his coffee untouched, muttering something under his breath. Then there was the missing necklace. My colleague Jenna mentioned losing it during lunch last week. It wasn't just any necklace. It was a delicate gold chain, a gift from her mother, and she was devastated. She searched everywhere but came up empty-handed. "I swear I had it at my desk," she said, frustrated. I helped her look, but the necklace had vanished without a trace. I couldn't explain it, but the growing unease surrounding Marcus and the memory of Jenna's missing necklace lingered in my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. Marcus's behavior escalated as the week went on. I began noticing small but unsettling things. Papers crumpled and discarded on his desk, riddled with what looked like nonsensical scribbles. He started leaving the office later than usual, lingering long after everyone else had gone home. Once I thought I heard faint noises from his office as I walked to the parking lot, a rhythmic tapping, like something heavy being placed repeatedly on a desk. The tension in the office was palpable, but no one dared address it directly. Most of my coworkers simply avoided Marcus, their sidelong glances filled with unease. Even Jenna seemed to grow quieter, her usual cheerfulness dulled by an invisible weight. I couldn't stop thinking about the noises, the scraps of paper, and the growing discomfort Marcus's presence seemed to radiate. One evening, I lingered at my desk longer than usual, watching as the office slowly emptied. Marcus's door was slightly ajar, and the faint sound of rustling came from within. My pulse quickened as I considered going inside, but I hesitated. What would I even say if he caught me? Still, the curiosity gnawed at me, growing harder to ignore with each passing day. That night, I stayed late under the pretense of finishing a report, though my real intention was to satisfy the burning questions in my mind. By the time I finally approached Marcus's office, the building was eerily quiet, the fluorescent lights casting long, cold shadows across the floor. His door creaked slightly as I pushed it open, revealing a cluttered, chaotic space that seemed to reflect the turmoil in its occupant's mind. The first thing I noticed was the smell, an odd metallic tang mixed with the musty scent of old paper. His desk was covered with scattered notes, each one scrawled with strange symbols, half-formed sentences, and words crossed out in heavy strokes. Among the papers was a small, tarnished box, its lid slightly open. Inside, I found Jenna's necklace. My breath caught as I picked it up, the gold chain glinting faintly under the harsh light. What was it doing here? And why would Marcus have taken it? My heart raced as I turned the necklace over in my hands, my mind racing with possibilities. Before I could process what I'd found, a shadow moved in the doorway. I froze, the necklace dangling from my fingers, as Marcus stepped into the room. "What are you doing?" Marcus's voice was low and sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife. His eyes locked onto the necklace in my hand, and his expression darkened. "That's mine," he said, stepping closer. My instinct was to apologize, to explain, but the words caught in my throat. This is Jenna's," I stammered, taking a step back. "She's been looking for it." Marcus's face twisted into a sneer. "You shouldn't be in here," he snapped, his voice rising. "You don't know what you're talking about." He took another step toward me, his movements deliberate and menacing. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with tension. Marcus's presence filled the space, his anger radiating like heat. My pulse pounded as I clutched the necklace tightly, my mind screaming at me to leave. "Marcus, Give it back," he interrupted, his voice now a growl. His hand reached out toward me, but I darted around the desk, narrowly avoiding his grasp. The movement seemed to enrage him further. You have no idea what you're messing with, he said, his tone low and venomous. I didn't wait to hear more. Clutching the necklace, I bolted out of the office, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. Behind me, Marcus's voice called out, angry and insistent, but I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached my car, slamming the door and locking it as my hands trembled on the steering wheel. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Marcus's face, his anger, the intensity in his eyes as he lunged toward me. My apartment, usually a sanctuary, felt suffocating as I paced the living room, clutching Jenna's necklace in my hands. The questions wouldn't stop. Why did Marcus have the necklace? Why had he reacted so aggressively? And what was with the strange notes and the clutter in his office? My mind replayed the confrontation over and over, dissecting every detail. I considered calling Jenna or even the police, but the thought of explaining what I'd done, snooping in a coworker's office, felt embarrassing. Worse, I couldn't shake the fear of retaliation if Marcus found out I'd reported him. The hours dragged by, my anxiety mounting with every creak and groan of my apartment. I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows, feeling exposed and vulnerable. By the time the sun finally began to rise, I had made up my mind. I would return the necklace to Jenna, warn her about Marcus, and figure out the next steps from there. The office felt strangely subdued when I arrived the next morning, the usual hum of activity replaced by an eerie quiet. Jenna was already at her desk, her smile faint but genuine as she greeted me. "Hey, you look tired," she said, her concern evident. I hesitated before pulling the necklace from my pocket. "I found this," I said, holding it out to her. It was in Marcus's office. Her eyes widened as she took the necklace, turning it over in her hands. This is mine," she said softly, her voice laced with confusion. "But why would he have it?" "I don't know," I admitted, glancing around the office nervously. "But I think you should be careful. He's been acting strange." Jenna frowned, her expression a mix of gratitude and unease. "Thanks for finding it," she said, lowering her voice. "I'll keep my distance from him." I nodded, relieved to have returned the necklace, but still unsettled by the memory of Marcus's reaction. As I made my way to my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The office seemed off somehow, quieter than it should have been. Later that morning, I noticed something unusual. Marcus's office door was closed, and his nameplate was missing. Curious, I approached the office, only to find it completely empty. The desk, the clutter, the strange notes, everything was gone. It was as though Marcus had never worked there. "Where's Marcus?" I asked one of my colleagues. Trying to sound casual, they shrugged. "I heard he left suddenly. Something about a personal emergency. Weird, right?" Weird didn't even begin to cover it. My mind raced as I processed the information. How could he have cleared out his office so quickly? And why had no one else seemed to notice or care? The emptiness of his office felt like a void, a black hole where all the answers I needed had been sucked away. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I kept expecting Marcus to show up, to demand the necklace back or confront me again, but he never did. By the time I left the office, I was more confused than ever, the lingering unease gnawing at me like a splinter buried deep under my skin. I was sitting in my living room when my phone vibrated with an alert. At first, I dismissed it as another routine notification, but the message caught my eye. It was an unfamiliar number, brief and desperate. "Please help, location shared, urgent." Attached was a pin drop in the middle of nowhere, an unmarked area miles outside of town. I should have ignored it. Everything about it felt strange, but something in me couldn't. What if it was real? What if someone truly needed help? I reasoned that it wouldn't take long to check and decided to drive out there. Grabbing a flashlight, my phone, and little else, I set off into the fading daylight. The drive took me away from familiar roads, past the last remnants of suburban life, into the quiet desolation of the countryside. The sun dipped lower, casting long, twisting shadows across the empty fields. I followed the GPS with a growing sense of unease, finally pulling up to a narrow dirt road. It led to what appeared to be an abandoned property, overgrown with weeds and half hidden behind leaning trees. I parked and stepped out. The stillness was unsettling. No wind, no sounds, just the heavy silence of the place. Something about it didn't feel right, but I told myself to push forward. Someone was waiting. The property was larger than it had seemed. What little light remained illuminated a series of dilapidated structures scattered across the grounds. A rusted gate hung open, creaking slightly as I pushed it aside. My flashlight revealed details that only deepened the sense of unease. Scattered objects, like a child's toy and a single boot strewn haphazardly in the dirt. I called out, my voice thin against the silence. No reply. I walked toward the largest structure, a sagging barn with a gaping entrance. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay and mildew. Something scuttled in the shadows, but my beam of light found nothing. That's when I saw it, a single chair in the center of the barn, lit by the last rays of sunlight streaming through a broken window. On the ground near the chair was a small puddle, dark and sticky. Blood, I realized. The sight rooted me in place. My instincts screamed to leave, but I couldn't. Not yet. I turned to leave and nearly stumbled. A set of heavy footprints, larger than mine, led out the way I had come. Someone had been here, and they weren't far. I followed the footprints cautiously, keeping my flashlight low. They led around the side of the barn to a shed. Its door hung slightly ajar. Stepping inside, I found more evidence. A tattered backpack, a torn piece of clothing, and what appeared to be claw marks on the walls. The signs were deliberate, almost staged. It didn't add up. The door slammed shut behind me. I spun, my flashlight catching only empty space. Panic surged as I reached for the door, but it wouldn't budge. I felt trapped, the shed closing in around me. From outside came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate. Whoever they belonged to didn't speak or announce themselves. Instead, they stopped just outside, lingering in silence. My heart pounded as I waited, bracing for the worst. The silence stretched on until finally the footsteps retreated. I forced the door open, emerging into the night. The air felt colder now, the shadows thicker. I realized I wasn't alone here. Someone had set this up, lured me in, and now they were watching. I stumbled deeper into the property, not caring where I was going. All I knew was that I needed to get away from the shed, from whatever or whoever was out there. That's when I saw movement, a figure darting between the trees. "Hey!" I called, though my voice was shaky. The figure hesitated, then turned toward me. As they stepped into the light, I saw a man, disheveled and wide-eyed. He looked as though he'd been here for days. "Are you?" I began, but stopped myself. He didn't need questions. He needed help, just like I did. He motioned for me to follow. We moved in silence, navigating the darkened property. He led me to a hiding spot, a crawl space beneath another structure. Inside, he whispered just enough for me to understand. He'd received a call for help, too, days ago. He'd fallen into the same trap and had been unable to leave since. Together, we pooled our thoughts, piecing together the clues. Whoever had done this was still out there, and they were playing with us. The air felt heavier now, the danger more real. We had to escape, but how? The man and I decided we couldn't stay hidden for long. Whoever was orchestrating this was likely watching us, waiting for their moment. We crawled out from the hiding spot and moved carefully, sticking to the shadows. The moonlight barely pierced the dense canopy of trees above, leaving us mostly in darkness. The property was vast, larger than I'd thought, and full of twists and dead ends. Every structure we approached seemed designed to mislead us. A small cabin looked like a possible refuge, but inside, the windows had been boarded up, and the door locked from the outside. Another building appeared empty until we stepped inside and found sharp wires strung at ankle level, as if waiting for someone to run blindly through. Each discovery felt like a cruel taunt. This wasn't random. Whoever had set this up knew exactly how to corral us, like rats in a maze. My companion pointed out cameras, small and discreet, hidden among the branches or nailed to the sides of buildings. Someone was watching every move we made. The night grew colder, and fatigue set in. My legs ached from crouching and climbing over obstacles. Each time we thought we found a path out, it looped back toward the center of the property. It was as if the land itself refused to let us go. Still, we pressed on, driven by the faint hope that somewhere there was an exit. We stumbled upon an odd structure, an old tool shed that seemed untouched by the elements. Unlike the other buildings, this one had no signs of decay. Its door creaked loudly as we pushed it open, revealing what looked like a command center. Monitors lined one wall, each displaying a different part of the property. The feeds were live, showing every dark corner we'd passed through. My stomach churned at the sight of us on one of the screens, huddled in the tool shed. On a nearby table, there were stacks of handwritten notes, maps, and what looked like profiles of other people. Photos, names, and scribbled observations. My companion rifled through them while I focused on the monitors. In the notes, the patterns became clear. This wasn't the first time someone had been lured here. The profiles were records of previous victims, some marked with dates and red X's. None had been marked as survived. The purpose wasn't entirely clear, but the meticulousness suggested someone who thrived on control and manipulation. The thought of being just another piece in their twisted game made my skin crawl. A faint sound broke the silence, a click, almost imperceptible. One of the monitors shifted, revealing a new angle, the tool shed we were in. Someone was coming. Panic surged as we fled the tool shed, abandoning the disturbing evidence behind. We couldn't risk staying in one place. The sound of movement followed us, heavy, deliberate steps that seemed to close the distance no matter how far we ran. My companion took the lead, pointing out traps and hazards as we ran through the maze of trees and buildings. At one point, we reached a fence, tall and lined with barbed wire. It felt like the edge of the world, the final boundary keeping us locked inside. My companion boosted me up, and I clawed my way over, ignoring the sting of the barbs slicing into my hands. When I dropped to the other side, I turned to help him up. That's when I saw them, a figure stepping out of the shadows, their face obscured but their intent unmistakable. They didn't run or rush, they simply stood there, watching. "Go!" my companion shouted, waving me off, but I hesitated, torn between helping and escaping. He shoved me back, forcing me to run. I heard the struggle behind me as I fled into the night, heart pounding, lungs burning. I ran until I couldn't anymore. The property seemed endless, but eventually I broke free, stumbling onto a dirt road under the pale glow of dawn. My legs gave out and I collapsed, staring up at the lightning sky. I didn't know where I was, but I didn't care. I was out. It started with small things, the kind of oddities you could easily blame on a distracted mind. A book moved slightly off-center on the coffee table. My phone charger, always left plugged in by the couch, coiled neatly on the kitchen counter. I remember the first time it struck me as unusual. I had left for work that morning with my travel mug sitting on the kitchen island. When I came home, it was on the dining table. At first, I told myself I must have moved it without thinking. I even laughed about it. Maybe I was getting forgetful. But as the days passed, these little inconsistencies began piling up. The faint smell of something unfamiliar, a musky, earthy scent, lingered in the air when I walked through the door. My bathroom mirror, always spotless, started showing faint smudges that didn't match my habits. The moment that tipped me from curious to alarmed came on a Tuesday night. I was getting ready for bed when I noticed the faintest creak of a floorboard from somewhere downstairs. I froze, listening intently, but the sound didn't repeat. I checked every door and window that night, finding nothing out of place. Still, I slept poorly, waking at every imagined noise. It wasn't until the following week, when I found the basement light on, that I realized something might be seriously wrong. I hadn't been in the basement in weeks. The thought of someone else being in my house made my skin crawl. I spent the entire next day in a fog of unease, distracted at work and rushing home as soon as I could. I went through every room, looking for anything, any clue that I wasn't alone. Nothing. The windows were locked, the doors secure, and there wasn't a sign of forced entry. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. By the time the weekend rolled around, I had a solution: security cameras. I bought a set that evening and spent hours installing them, one in the living room, one by the kitchen, and one facing the basement door. The system linked to my phone, letting me review footage remotely. The first night passed without incident. I reviewed the recordings the next morning, half expecting to see shadows moving or doors creaking open on their own. There was nothing, and I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. But on the second night, everything changed. The figure appeared around 2:30 a.m. At first, they were little more than a shifting shadow near the basement door. Then they stepped fully into view, a tall, thin shape cloaked in darkness. their face obscured by the grainy footage. They moved with eerie familiarity, heading straight for the kitchen and opening cabinets, as though they lived here. By dawn, they had returned to the basement, vanishing without a trace. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, replaying the footage over and over. The intruder wasn't just breaking in. They were already here, emerging from the basement like some shadow pulled from the walls. My hands shook as I locked the basement door and double-checked every window and entry point in the house. That afternoon, I armed myself with a flashlight and a heavy wrench. I stood at the basement door for what felt like an eternity before finally mustering the courage to open it. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across the cluttered space below. The basement smelled of damp and mildew, mixed with something sour and organic. My eyes adjusted slowly to the gloom, picking out signs I had missed before: a crumpled blanket in the corner, empty cans of food tucked behind a support beam, and smudges of dirt trailing across the concrete floor. Someone had been living here. Near the far wall, I found the source of the disturbance: a hole, roughly 3 feet wide, dug into the floor. The edges were jagged and uneven, leading down into a tunnel that disappeared into the darkness. I stood at the edge of the hole, shining my flashlight into its depths. The beam illuminated rough, dirt walls descending steeply into what appeared to be an old, brick-lined tunnel. The smell of damp earth and stagnant water rose up to meet me, thick and oppressive. Climbing down wasn't an option, not without proper gear and a stronger stomach. Still, I needed to know where it led. Retracing my steps to the garage, I grabbed a rope ladder, securing it to the edge of the hole before descending cautiously. The air grew colder the further I went, my breathing shallow as I finally landed on the tunnel floor. It was unmistakably part of the city's sewer system, an ancient section I hadn't known existed. The walls were slick with condensation, and the ground beneath my feet was uneven and littered with debris. My flashlight caught glimpses of scurrying rats and stagnant pools of water as I followed the tunnel's curve. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This was how they were getting in. The tunnel connected directly to the basement, offering unfettered access to my home. It was horrifying, not just the thought of someone crawling through here, but the deliberate effort it must have taken to dig that hole and remain undetected. I couldn't stay down there any longer. My nerves frayed. I climbed back to the basement, resolved to end this intrusion once and for all. I spent the rest of the day gathering supplies to seal the hole. I wasn't going to let whoever was using it have another opportunity to invade my home. My first instinct was to call the police, but I hesitated. What would I even tell them? That someone had dug a hole from my basement into the sewers? The explanation sounded absurd even to me. Instead, I focused on solving the immediate problem. I bought cinder blocks, heavy boards, and a bucket of concrete from the local hardware store. When I got home, I locked every door and window, then carried the materials into the basement. The space felt heavier somehow, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I started with the concrete, filling the edges of the hole to create a barrier between the tunnel and the basement floor. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My flashlight, balanced on a crate, cast long, wavering shadows that seemed to move on their own. I kept my back to the wall, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, but nothing appeared. When the concrete had dried enough to support weight, I began layering cinder blocks over the opening, securing them with mortar. Each block felt like a small victory, a physical barrier between me and the unknown. Finally, I topped the structure with a thick wooden board, nailing it down for good measure. By the time I finished, the sun had set and my body ached from the effort. I climbed the stairs and locked the basement door behind me, leaving the reinforced hole and the horrors of the tunnel sealed below. For the first time in weeks, the house felt quiet, too quiet. The usual creaks and groans of the old structure seemed muted, as if the place itself was holding its breath. I tried to convince myself that I had succeeded, that sealing the hole had put an end to the intrusion. Days passed without incident. The faint smells, the misplaced objects, and the odd sounds, all of it stopped. Still, I couldn't relax. Every night I found myself staring at the basement door, half expecting it to swing open on its own. The cameras showed nothing, no sign of the shadowy figure that had haunted my nights. But the silence didn't feel like relief. It felt like anticipation, like the calm before a storm. I couldn't shake the sense that whoever or whatever had been using that tunnel wasn't done with me yet. One night, I woke to a faint tapping sound. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, a rhythmic knock coming from somewhere deep within the house. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to pinpoint the source. It wasn't coming from the walls or the floor above me. It was coming from below, the basement. I armed myself with the heaviest flashlight I owned and crept down the stairs. My breathing was shallow, each step feeling heavier than the last. The sound grew louder as I approached the sealed hole, now covered in dust and cobwebs. The tapping stopped just as I reached it. The air was thick and stale, heavy with the damp smell of concrete. I ran the flashlight over the cinder blocks, half expecting to see them cracked or shifted, but they were intact. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just on the other side. As I turned to leave, I noticed something on the workbench near the far wall. It was a key, an old, tarnished thing I didn't recognize. My skin prickled as I picked it up. I hadn't left it there, and no one else should have been able to. The disturbances ceased entirely after that night. The tapping never returned, and the cameras showed nothing but static silence. It was late, and I was tired. The streets were quiet, dimly lit by orange streetlights, as I waited at the curb for my ride. When the car pulled up, an unassuming sedan with a rideshare sticker on the windshield, I climbed into the back seat without a second thought. Two other passengers were already inside, a man in his 30s scrolling on his phone, and a woman closer to my age who gave me a polite nod. The driver greeted us with a clipped "evening," his voice gruff but unremarkable. He was older, with thinning hair and a stoic expression, eyes fixed on the road ahead. The car smelled faintly of stale cigarettes, but it was clean enough. The ride began without issue, the familiar ding of the app announcing our route. The first few minutes were uneventful. The man with the phone stayed engrossed in whatever he was reading, and the woman stared out the window. I leaned back, letting the hum of the engine and the soft shuffle of tires on asphalt lull me into a false sense of security. It wasn't until we turned off the main road, taking a route I didn't recognize, that something felt off. The GPS on my phone showed a straight path to our destination, but the car veered sharply onto a side street. The driver made no announcement, no apology, just pressed forward, taking us farther from the main road. I frowned, glancing at the map on my phone. We weren't going the right way. "Is this a shortcut?" the woman asked hesitantly, breaking the silence. Her voice carried a nervous edge, and I could tell I wasn't the only one unsettled. "Shortcut," the driver replied curtly, his tone flat. He didn't elaborate. His hands gripped the wheel tighter, the knuckles whitening as he maneuvered through the narrow, unfamiliar streets. The unease in the car was palpable now. The man with the phone looked up, his brows furrowed as he stared out the window. "Doesn't look like a shortcut," he muttered, half to himself. I checked the app again, but it showed us straying farther from the intended route. The road ahead grew darker, the streetlights sparse and dim. Trees loomed on either side, their shadows swallowing the car. A heavy silence settled in, broken only by the sound of tires crunching on uneven pavement. The atmosphere in the car shifted. The driver's movements grew more erratic, his foot pressing harder on the accelerator as the road twisted and turned. The sedan jolted over a pothole, causing the woman to gasp and grab the door handle. "Can you slow down?" she asked, her voice trembling. The driver didn't respond. He stared straight ahead, his face an unreadable mask. My pulse quickened as I realized how fast we were going, too fast for these narrow roads. The man in the passenger seat leaned forward. "Hey man, what's going on? Why are we off route?" The driver muttered something under his breath, too low for us to hear. Then he laughed, a short, sharp sound that sent a chill down my spine. He pressed harder on the gas, the speedometer climbing as the trees outside became a blur. Panic rippled through the car. The woman clutched her bag tightly, her knuckles white. The man beside me swore under his breath, gripping the seat in front of him as the car swerved dangerously close to the edge of the road. I gripped my phone tightly, my mind racing for a solution. Calling for help seemed impossible. No service in this remote area. The car barreled deeper into isolation, taking sharp turns onto gravel paths that seemed to lead nowhere. My chest tightened as the realization set in. We were completely at the mercy of this man. The locks on the doors clicked automatically when we started the ride, and the thought of being trapped made my skin crawl. The woman tried again, her voice trembling but louder this time. "Please, stop the car. We don't want to go this way." The driver didn't respond. Instead, he glanced at the rearview mirror, his eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite place. Amusement? Malice? His hand jerked the wheel suddenly, sending the car lurching to one side. The tires skidded on the loose gravel before regaining traction, and we were plunged deeper into the dark, unmarked road. The man beside me tried the door, yanking at the handle in frustration. "Locked," he muttered, his voice tight with fear. He turned to me, his eyes wide. "Do you have any idea where we are?" I didn't. The GPS showed us as a blinking dot in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a gray expanse of unmarked terrain. My heart pounded as I considered our options, which felt slim. Confronting the driver seemed dangerous, but doing nothing felt worse. Every second brought us farther from safety. Suddenly, the car hit another pothole, this time hard enough to make the dashboard rattle. The driver cursed under his breath, his calm facade cracking. "Damn roads," he growled, slamming the steering wheel. The car sputtered, the engine struggling against the strain. It was the first glimmer of hope I'd felt all night. The car lurched forward unevenly, the sputtering engine struggling to maintain speed. The sudden jolt threw us all against our seats, and for the first time, the driver seemed genuinely rattled. His grip on the wheel tightened, his jaw clenched, and he muttered angrily under his breath. "Something's wrong with the car," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. The man beside me leaned forward again, desperation creeping into his tone. "Pull over. You're going to wreck this thing." The driver ignored him, his foot pressing harder on the gas pedal as if sheer force could will the car into cooperating. The speedometer began to drop, no matter how much he pushed, and I could hear the faint hiss of the engine giving out. Suddenly, the car slowed to a crawl, the sputtering engine choking on its final breath. The driver cursed loudly, pounding the steering wheel as the vehicle rolled to a stop in the middle of a narrow dirt road surrounded by dense trees. The headlights illuminated nothing but an endless expanse of shadowy woods. My heart raced. This was our chance. The moment the car stopped, I reached for the door handle, pulling at it desperately. Locked. I glanced at the driver, who was fumbling with something under the dashboard, his movements frantic and distracted. "Unlock the doors!" The man beside me shouted, his voice shaking. The woman was already clawing at her own handle, her panic palpable. Without warning, the locks disengaged with a loud click. Whether it was a malfunction or the driver's distraction, I didn't care. "Run!" I shouted, throwing the door open and bolting into the night. The cold air hit my face as I stumbled onto the uneven ground, my legs moving before I could even process where I was going. Behind me, I heard the other two passengers scrambling out of the car, their footsteps pounding the dirt road. The driver shouted something, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of our frantic escape. The trees loomed like dark sentinels on either side of the road. There was no clear path, no sign of civilization, just the endless stretch of dirt and the oppressive silence of the woods. My lungs burned as I ran, my ears straining for any sound of pursuit. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves felt like the driver closing in. The woman was the first to catch up to me, her breaths coming in sharp, panicked gasps. Where are we going?" she stammered, glancing over her shoulder. The man was a few steps behind her, his face pale in the moonlight. "Just keep moving," I said, though I had no idea where we were headed. The only goal was distance, putting as much space as possible between us and the car. Behind us, the headlights dimmed as the engine finally died completely. For a moment, I thought we were safe. Then I saw the driver emerge from the vehicle, his silhouette illuminated briefly in the fading light. He wasn't walking, he was running. Panic surged through me, driving me forward with renewed urgency. The uneven road gave way to patches of loose gravel and overgrown roots, each step threatening to trip me. The others stayed close, their labored breathing the only sound besides my own. Ahead, the faint outline of a larger road came into view, a strip of asphalt cutting through the wilderness. Relief mingled with fear as I realized we might have a chance to flag someone down, but it was still too far. The driver's footsteps echoed behind us, faster and closer than I wanted to admit. The man beside me veered off the path suddenly, motioning for us to follow. "This way," he hissed, leading us into the dense underbrush. The branches scratched at my arms and face as we pushed through, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. We crouched low behind a fallen tree, struggling to silence our breathing. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would give us away. The driver's footsteps slowed, his shadowy figure appearing on the road just a few feet away. He stopped, turning his head as if listening. For what felt like an eternity, we stayed frozen, watching as the driver scanned the area. Then, without warning, he turned and sprinted back toward the car. None of us dared move until the sound of his footsteps faded entirely. We didn't stop running until we reached the main road. The relief of stepping onto solid asphalt was almost overwhelming, but the fear hadn't fully subsided. The driver could still be out there, waiting, watching. We stuck together, waving frantically at the first set of headlights we saw. A truck slowed, its driver rolling down the window with a concerned look. "What's going on?" he asked, eyeing our disheveled appearances. The woman was the first to speak, her voice trembling as she recounted the basics. A rideshare gone wrong, a driver who had lost control, and an escape that could have ended much differently. The truck driver offered us a ride to the nearest gas station, and we didn't hesitate to accept. As we climbed into the truck bed, I felt the weight of exhaustion settle over me. We were safe, but the memory of the driver's erratic behavior and the sheer terror of that ride lingered. The sun was dipping low as I drove along the winding, unfamiliar road. I was hours away from home, and the stretch of countryside felt desolate. Just me, the empty fields, and the faint hum of my car. It was supposed to be a quick day trip, but a series of wrong turns had delayed me. And now, as the last rays of daylight faded, I just wanted to get back. That's when it happened. A sharp thud followed by a strange pull to the right. I eased the car onto the gravel shoulder, my stomach sinking as I stepped out to check. A flat tire. The deflation hissed faintly, mocking me as I stared at the punctured rubber. I wasn't prepared for this. I didn't have a spare, and my phone showed no signal. I leaned against the hood, weighing my options, when a set of headlights appeared in the distance. Relief washed over me. The car slowed as it approached, pulling to a stop just behind mine. A man stepped out, middle-aged and clean-cut, wearing a plaid shirt and jeans. His expression was friendly, his demeanor casual. "Need a hand?" he asked, glancing at my tire. "Looks like you've had a bit of bad luck." I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I don't have a spare and there's no service out here. I'd appreciate it." "Not a problem," he said with an easy smile. "Let me grab my jack and tools." As he walked back to his truck, I felt a flicker of unease, small, fleeting, and easy to ignore. After all, he was just being helpful. What reason did I have to worry? The man worked quickly, kneeling by the flat tire and chatting as he set up the jack. His tone was friendly, even charming, but something about the way he spoke felt off. His questions were just a bit too personal. "So you out here all by yourself?" he asked, glancing up at me. "Just passing through," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Must be nice," he said, pausing to wipe his hands. "No one to slow you down, huh?" I forced a polite laugh, but didn't respond. He didn't need to know anything about me. Yet he kept talking, asking where I was headed, if I lived nearby, if anyone knew I was out here. Each question felt innocuous on its own, but together they painted a picture I didn't like. His movements were efficient, almost practiced, but he seemed to linger over the task, taking longer than necessary to loosen the lug nuts. I glanced toward the truck he'd arrived in, noting how its interior light spilled onto the gravel. The cab was cluttered, boxes, blankets, and something metallic glinting faintly under the seat. "So," he said, breaking my thoughts, "what do you do for a living? You must keep busy." The question caught me off guard. I stammered something vague about office work, wishing I'd said nothing at all. His gaze lingered on me a beat too long before he went back to the tire. That flicker of unease from earlier was growing harder to ignore. As the minutes ticked by, the man's demeanor shifted subtly. His cheerfulness took on a strange edge, his questions becoming less about helping and more about keeping me engaged. "You know, not many people come through this way," he said, standing up to stretch. "Lucky I happened by when I did." "Yeah, lucky," I replied, forcing a smile. He stepped closer, brushing off his hands. "You know, I could drive you into town once we get this sorted. It's not far, and you'd be safer with someone who knows the area." I took a step back instinctively, my pulse quickening. "That's okay. I'll figure it out once the tire's fixed." His smile didn't falter, but there was something behind it now, a shadow of annoyance, maybe. "Suit yourself," he said, turning back to the car. "But you're better off sticking with me. A lot of strange folks out here." His words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. My unease deepened, and I edged closer to the driver's side door, my hand brushing against the handle. The man seemed to notice, his movements slowing as he tightened the last bolt. "Almost done," he said, his voice lower now, almost too calm. "You'll be on your way in no time." But I didn't feel reassured. I felt trapped. The air felt oppressive as the man stood, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't step back from the car, didn't give me space to move. Instead, he leaned against the hood, crossing his arms as though he had no intention of leaving. "You know," he said casually, "it's getting pretty late. Roads like this can be dangerous. You sure you don't need a ride? I'd hate to see something happen to you." The words sent a chill through me, their tone far from friendly. My mind raced, searching for a way out. "I appreciate the help, but I really should get going," I said, trying to sound firm. His expression hardened slightly. "Well, don't rush off too quick. You might run into trouble again. Tire could go flat if it's not done right." I glanced at the car, trying to gauge if it was drivable. "I'll take my chances," I said, reaching for the door handle. My hand closed around it, and he moved closer. Before he could speak, I interrupted him. "Actually, I just remembered, I have to call someone. They're expecting me soon." I pulled out my phone, pretending to scroll. "Looks like I have service after all." His demeanor shifted again, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. He took a step back, his hands raising in mock surrender. All right," he said, his voice light but strained. "No need to get jumpy, just trying to help." I didn't wait for him to say more. I climbed into the car, started the engine, and pulled back onto the road without looking back. As I drove away, the tension in my chest didn't immediately subside. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, as I glanced repeatedly in the rearview mirror. The man's truck remained stationary for a moment, its headlights still illuminating the roadside. Then, just as I thought I was safe, the truck's engine roared to life, and it pulled onto the road behind me. Panic surged through me. I tried to tell myself it was coincidence, that he was simply leaving at the same time. But as the minutes passed, his truck remained a constant presence, following at a steady distance. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What did he want? Had I been too obvious in my attempt to get away? The road stretched endlessly ahead, a narrow ribbon of asphalt surrounded by dark fields. There were no side streets, no gas stations, no signs of civilization, just the oppressive dark and the truck's headlights trailing me like a predator stalking its prey. I checked my phone, praying for service, but the signal was still dead. My pulse quickened as I debated my options. Stopping wasn't one of them. My only hope was to keep driving and hope he'd lose interest, or that I'd find a place to get help. The truck followed me for miles, unwavering in its pursuit. My heart pounded as I spotted a faint glow in the distance, headlights from another vehicle heading in the opposite direction. It wasn't much, but it was enough to spark a plan. As the approaching car drew closer, I slowed slightly, hoping to force the truck behind me to pass. For a moment I thought it might work. The truck's headlights dipped as it began to slow, but then it swerved slightly, as though the driver were testing my resolve. The move sent a jolt of fear through me. The oncoming car passed, its lights illuminating the truck behind me for a split second. I caught a glimpse of the man in the driver's seat, his face eerily calm, almost blank. It chilled me more than any expression of anger or frustration could have. He wasn't just following me, he was toying with me. Desperation set in. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing my car to its limits as the truck loomed closer. I couldn't outrun him forever, but I had to try. Finally, the road split. A smaller side path branched off to the right, barely visible in the dim glow of my headlights. Without thinking, I jerked the wheel, veering onto the dirt road and leaving a cloud of dust in my wake. My car bounced over the uneven terrain, the sound of gravel crunching beneath my tires loud in the still night. For a moment, I thought I'd lost him. The truck's headlights disappeared from my rearview mirror, swallowed by the dust and darkness. Relief was short-lived, though, as the faint sound of an engine grew louder behind me. I scanned the road ahead, my heart sinking as I realized the dirt path was leading me nowhere. Just more fields and isolation. I needed to think fast. Spotting a cluster of trees ahead, I slowed and turned off my headlights, steering the car into the shadows. I killed the engine, holding my breath as the truck roared past, its headlights slicing through the night. My heart thundered in my chest as I watched the taillights grow smaller and smaller until they finally disappeared over the horizon. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. When I was sure he wasn't coming back, I restarted the car and carefully made my way back to the main road, sticking to the shadows until I felt safe enough to turn on my lights again.